Vivian Dorothea Maier was an American street photographer, who was born in New York City and spent much of her childhood in France. After returning to the United States, she worked for approximately 40 years as a nanny in Chicago, Illinois. During those years, she took more than 150,000 photographs, primarily of people and architecture of New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, although she traveled and photographed worldwide. Maier's photographs remained unknown, and many of her films remained undeveloped, until her boxes of possessions were auctioned off. A Chicago historian and collector, John Maloof, examined the images and started to post Maier's photographs on the web in 2009, soon after Maier's death. Critical acclaim and interest in Maier's work quickly followed. Maier's photographs have been exhibited in the USA, Europe and Asia and have been featured in many articles throughout the world. Her life and work have been the subject of both books and documentary films. Photography critic Alan Sekula has suggested that the fact that Maier spent much of her early life in France, sharpened her visual appreciation of American cities and society. Sekula compared her work with the photography of Swiss-born Robert Frank. "I find myself imagining her as a female Robert Frank, without a Guggenheim grant, unknown and working as a nanny to get by. I also think she showed the world of women and children in a way that is pretty much unprecedented." John Maloof has said of her work, "Elderly folk congregating in Chicago's old Polish downtown, garishly dressed dowagers, and the urban African-American experience were all fair game for Maier, Euro unregistered trademark S lens." Looking at Maier's over, photographer Mary Ellen Mark has compared Maier's work to that of Helen Levitt, Robert Frank, Lisette Model and Diane Arbus. Joel Meyerowitz, also a street photographer, has said that Maier, Euro unregistered trademark S work was suffused with the kind of human understanding, warmth and playfulness that proves she was a real shooter. Maier's best-known photographs depict street scenes in Chicago and New York during the 1950s and 1960s. A critic in The Independent wrote that the well-to-do shoppers of Chicago stroll and gossip in all their department store finery before Maier, but the most arresting subjects are those people on the margins of successful, rich America in the 1950s and 1960s, the kids, the black maids, the bums flaked out on shop stoops. Most of Maier, Euro unregistered trademark S photographs are black and white, and many feature casual shots of passers-by caught in transient moments that nonetheless possess an underlying gravity and emotion. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, William Mayers notes that because Maier used a medium-format Rolleiflex, rather than a 35mm camera, Maier's pictures have more detail than those of most street photographers. Mayers writes that Maier's work brings to mind the photographs of Harry Colahan, Gary Winogrand, and Weegee, as well as Robert Frank. Mayers also notes that there are a high number of self-portraits in Maier's work, in many ingenious permutations, as if she were checking on her own identity or interpolating herself into the environment. A shadowy character, she often photographed her own shadow, possibly as a way of being there and simultaneously not quite there. Roberta Smith, writing in the New York Times, has drawn attention to the way in which Maier's photographs are reminiscent of many famous 20th-century photographers, and yet have an aesthetic of their own. She writes that Maier's work may add to the history of 20th-century street photography by summing it up with an almost encyclopedic thoroughness, veering close to just about every well-known photographer you can think of, including Weegee, Robert Frank and Richard Avedon, and then sliding off in another direction. Yet they maintain a distinctive element of calm, a clarity of composition and a gentleness characterized by a lack of sudden movement or extreme emotion. In the documentary film, Finding Vivian Maier, the grown-up children whom Maier had cared for in the 1950s, 60s and 70s recall how she combined her work as a photographer with her day job as a nanny. She would frequently take the young children in her care with her into the center of Chicago, when she took her photographs. Occasionally they accompanied her to the rougher, run-down areas of Chicago, and, on one occasion, the stockyards, where there were bodies of dead sheep. In the late 1970s, Maier ceased to use her Rolleiflex. The majority of her photographs taken in the 1980s and 1990s were color transparencies, taken on Ektachrome film. discovery and recognition. In 2007, 2 years before she died, Maier failed to keep up payments on storage space she had rented on Chicago's North Side. As a result, her negatives, prints, audio recordings, and 8mm film, were auctioned. 3 photo collectors purchased parts of her work: John Maloof, Ron Slattery, and Randy Prow. Maier's photographs were first published on the Internet in July 2008 by Slattery, but the work received little response. Maloof had purchased the largest part of Maier's work, about 30,000 negatives, because he was working on a history book about the Chicago neighborhood of Portage Park. Maloof subsequently purchased more of Maier's photographs from another buyer at the same auction. Maloof discovered Maier's name in his boxes, but was unable to discover anything about her until a Google search led him to Maier's death notice in the Chicago Tribune in April 2009. In October 2009, Maloof linked his blog to a selection of Maier's photographs on Flickr, and the results went viral, with thousands of people expressing interest. In the spring of 2010, Chicago art collector Jeffrey Goldstein acquired a portion of the Maier collection from Prow, one of the original buyers. Since Goldstein's original purchase, his collection has grown to include 17,500 negatives, 2,000 prints, 30 homemade movies, and numerous slides. Maloof, who runs the Maloof collection, now owns 100,000 to 150,000 negatives, more than 3,000 vintage prints, hundreds of rolls of film, home movies, audio tape interviews, and ephemera including cameras and paperwork, which he claims represents roughly 90% of her known work. Since her posthumous discovery, Maier's photographs, and the way they were discovered, have received international attention in mainstream media, and her work has featured in gallery exhibitions, several books, and 2 documentary films. Personal life. Many details of Maier's life remain unknown. She was born in New York City, the daughter of a French mother, Maria Joussaud, and an Austrian father, Charles Maier. Several times during her childhood she moved between the US and France, living with her mother in the Alpine village of Saint-Bonnet-en-Champsaur near her mother's relations. Her father seems to have left the family temporarily for unknown reasons by 1930. In the 1930 census, the head of the household was listed Jean Bertrand, a successful photographer who knew Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art. In 1935, Vivian and her mother, Maria, were living in St. Julien-en-Champsaur and prior to 1940 returned to New York. Her father and brother Charles stayed in New York. The family of Charles, Maria, Vivian and Charles were living in New York in 1940, where her father worked as a steam engineer. In 1951, aged 25, Maier moved from France to New York, where she worked in a sweatshop. She moved to the Chicago area's North Shore in 1956, where for approximately 40 years, Maier worked on and off as a nanny. For her first 17 years in Chicago, Maier worked for 2 families, the Jensbergs from 1956 to 1972, and the Raymonds from 1967 to 1973. Lane Jensberg later said of Maier, "She was like a real, live Mary Poppins," and said she never talked down to kids and was determined to show them the world outside their affluent suburb. The families that employed her described her as very private and reported that she spent her days off walking the streets of Chicago and taking photographs, usually with a Rolleiflex camera. John Maloof, curator of some of Maier's photographs, summarizes the way the children she nannied would later describe her. She was a socialist, a feminist, a movie critic, and a tell-it-like-it-is type of person. She learned English by going to theaters, which she loved. She was constantly taking pictures, which she didn't show anyone. In 1959 and 1960, Maier took a trip around the world on her own, photographing Los Angeles, Manila, Bangkok, Shanghai, Beijing, India, Syria, Egypt and Italy. The trip was probably financed by the sale of a family farm in St. Julien-en-Champsaur. For a brief period in the 1970s, Maier worked as a nanny for Phil Donahue's children. She kept her belongings at her employer's. At one, she had 200 boxes of materials. Most were photographs or negatives, but Maier also collected newspapers, and sometimes recorded audio tapes of conversations she had with people she photographed. The Jensberg brothers, who Maier had looked after as children, tried to help her as she became poorer in old age. When Maier was about to be evicted from a cheap apartment in the suburb of Cicero, the Jensberg brothers arranged for Maier to live in a better apartment on Sheridan Road, North Chicago. In November 2008, Maier fell on the ice and hit her head. She was taken to hospital but failed to recover. In January 2009, Maier was transported to a nursing home in Highland Park, where she died on April 21, 2009. Books of Maier's photographs, John Maloof, ed. Vivian Maier, street photographer. Powerhouse Books. ISBN A978-1-57687-577-3. Kahan, Richard and Williams, Michael, Vivian Maier, Out of the Shadows. City Files Press, 2012. ISBN 978-0978545093. John Maloof, ed. Vivian Maier, Self-Portraits. Powerhouse Books. ISBN A978-1-57687-662-6. Kahan, Richard and Williams, Michael, Eye to Eye, Photographs by Vivian Maier. City Files Press, 2014. ISBN 9780791541805. Exhibitions. Documentary films about Maier, Vivian Maier, Who Took Nanny's Pictures, directed by Jill Nichols, produced by the BBC. This film was recut and released in the US in December 2013, as The Vivian Maier Mystery. Finding Vivian Maier, directed by John Maloof and Charlie Siskel. See also, Angelo Rizzuto, Charles Jones, references. External links, Maloof Collection website on Vivian Maier, Jeffrey Goldstein Collection website on Vivian Maier, Finding Vivian Maier, an interview with producer, co-director Charlie Siskel by Stephen Slaughterhead, postmovie.net, April 3, 2014, The Nanny's Secret by William Mayers, The Wall Street Journal, January 3, 2012, Vivian Maier, The Unheralded Street Photographer by David Sachs, Smithsonian Magazine, December 2011, Nanny Strangest, On Finding Vivian Maier, by Richard B. Woodward, The Wall Street Journal, March 25, 2014.